Hey guys, Mr. Thibodeau here. I kind of got a long one for you today. It's a whole chapter. So this is a lot of stuff for this week. Okay. After winning, turning the world upside down against the English, we were still in a pretty weird place. We did not know if we were going to have a bunch of different countries with each state, or if we were going to be able to actually have some sort of commonwealth or confederation. Or what actually happens is a federal government. Okay, a lot of that was up in the air. Okay, we had different thoughts here. Real quick, the Northwest Territory they're talking about, okay, is not where we live. This is the Northwest Territory. Here is what we would call Middle America for the most part, Great Lakes region. Okay, because that was the Northwest for them at the time. Okay. One of the important things is that it set each township also had to set aside land for a school. Okay, so we were really focusing on public good right from the beginning. Daniel Boone and some of these guys were already doing. He was already in trouble from the outset by the British because he was doing this before this was American territory, when this is British, and he was one of the reasons why the Native Americans were really upset. He's sometimes seen as a hero of early America. I'm less excited about him personally, but that's me. Anyway, we see a lot of this area slowly being settled, or really quickly being settled, actually. There was this thought that it was going to take America generations upon generations to settle all of this area, and it happened so insanely quickly. So interesting stuff there. We talk about being in a politically fraught climate, very difficult time to be alive, but yet America has always had a lot of issues of fighting and bloodshed as part of our political process. That's not a good thing, but it has been a consistent thing, to be honest. One of the interesting things here is it talks about them trying and figuring out how to pay off our debts. Every now and then you'll hear someone talking about how we still have debts from when the country was founding and our trillions of dollars of national debt today. It's actually not true. We will pay off all of our debt during Andrew Jackson's time, and we'll actually have no public debt. The interesting thing is we immediately hit a recession when he does that. Public debt is actually kind of important for a country to have. It allows them to do a lot of things with it. It's a lever that the national government can use to affect the economy, which is what's happening right now. It's how they're fighting inflation. But Shays' Rebellion here, we see a lot of people being fed up with how all of this is happening. Okay, people were owed money because of their fighting in the army. Their money is not quite working out that way. They're really upset that their economy is kind of in the tanks and things have not settled out for them the way that they were hoping. And now a number of people are losing their land because they can't pay these debts because their government's money is not worth anything, or it's just a bunch of stuff that all kind of happened as our early government really does not have its act together. You see situations where Congress is asking for people to send troops to put down this armed rebellion. Other states just refuse. They're like, no, you guys can handle it. I'm not sending my goods to die here. We've already fought enough. And it really shows that Congress doesn't have a lot of power during these early Articles of Confederation. So Shays' Rebellion is a big deal. It is interesting. Massachusetts passes the Riot Act, which prohibits or stops armed groups from gathering in public, which is really interesting because we have today groups that will show up with their AK-47s or whatnot and have, essentially assault rifles in public, and they'll gather at different protests and they'll show up armed to protests. And in certain states, that's legal. In other states, that's not legal. Massachusetts still has a version of the Riot Act on their books. Okay, now is this constitutional? Well, this actually predates our Constitution, so But it's interesting to see how some of these things are still going on today. Constitutional Convention, trying to get people figured out, okay, we have to change something. This is not working. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to set aside our stuff and figure it out? Okay. Interesting sort of look at the painting and the framers. This is basically Alexander Hamilton's jam. If you listen to or have watched Hamilton, it's all about this stuff. It's a bias there too, but it is an interesting story. He was critical to creating and setting up the federal government that we have today, whether you love him or hate him. Virginia Plan, New Jersey Plan, the Great Compromise. Okay, super powerful here. I think this was a great. I think this is way better than having just one of these. Two houses, of course, you get gridlock. Okay, say for instance, the Democrats currently have a majority in the Senate, but not in the House. So the likelihood they're going to be able to do anything in the next session is probably very, very unlikely because they have to pass in both. The gridlock, we had gridlock last 2 years basically because of a filibuster rule. Even though the Democrats had 50 people plus Kamala Harris, the vice president, to break ties in the Senate last 2 years. It was still basically gridlock because in the Senate, to pass most things, you actually need 60 votes. You need to have a supermajority. And so it has to be filibuster proof. Otherwise, people will just filibuster or even threaten to filibuster. They don't actually have to do a full filibuster, which is where you just talk and talk and talk and you run out the clock. They changed the rules to just say that you could threaten a filibuster and it would kill it. So people are now threatening it any which way without actually having to do any work. But in any case, the Senate, even though it was technically in the Democrats' position last 2 years, it really wasn't because the Democrats didn't have enough power to pass most of the things they wanted to. They could only pass like one or two things. Still having majority, the Democrats were able to do. And once you have a majority, even if it's not enough to pass things, you can still, the Senate is in charge of setting up judges. So Trump passed a bunch of judges when he had control of the Senate. Biden is passing a bunch of judges now. Mostly we are actually really low on judges, so it's critical to try to get that figured out. When Obama was president and the Republicans controlled the Senate, they're two different parties. So Obama would recommend somebody for a judgeship, and the Republicans would say, no, we don't like that guy. And so very little was getting done. And that's kind of what happens when these two houses are in gridlock. But that's the nature of what we have planned. Kind of helps to make change a little slower, which is usually healthier. Some people argue it's too slow, which is probably which might be a pretty solid criticism of our situation. But generally, though, I think it's good to have popular vote and then two votes per state. This would change drastically if we got a new state. Okay, say for instance, if Puerto Rico became a state. So lots of things that could change there. All right. This is the biggest thing I want to talk about: 3/5 compromise. We talk about this today as a bad thing, but people usually get confused when we talk about it as a bad thing. Considering a black person as 3/5 of a person instead of a whole person, that seems like bad. That seems like, well, of course they're a whole person. You should consider, all people should be considered a whole person, not 3/5 of a person. The irony here, the thing that people fail to understand, is it would have been better for black people at this time, and this is, slaves, Free black people in the North were counted as a whole person. For slaves to not have been counted at all, okay, when they're counted as 3/5 of a person, they are adding to the number of House seats, okay, in the House of Representatives that the Southern they were almost Democrats, so not quite there yet. The Southern representatives are going to get. So the slave-owning people in the South are going to have far more power in the House of Representatives because they're counting their slaves as 3/5 of a person, thus increasing the amount of state's population that is counted for the state representatives. Okay, so the slave-owning folks in the South are going to have way more power in the House than they probably should have, okay? Because they're counting black folks or they're counting slaves as 3/5 of a person, but they're absolutely not voting in their for their constituency, right? Slaves are not being represented by these slave-owning folks in the House of Representatives. Their issues are not being brought to light. The slaves do not get to vote. So when we talk about how awful it was that slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person and not as a full person, yes, but really it would have been better if they weren't counted at all, if there were 0 people. Because this is one of the reasons that'll lead to the Civil War and the issues there is slavery is going to grow, and you cannot outlaw slavery because the slave-owning South has so much power in the House of Representatives because their population is considering all of these slaves who are not really represented by these slave-owning white folks. So that's kind of the interesting thing here, okay? So it's a little counterintuitive. The slave-owning white folks would have been more than happy to count every single slave as a full person. That's what they wanted, because that would have given them yet even more population, even more power than the North, okay? So that's what this House of Representatives and this 3/5 compromise is all about, okay? The other thing here is the slave importation clause. The idea was that we were going to slowly ease off slavery. We were going to stop the ban, where we were going to ban importing slaves after 20 years, and then you would no longer be able to bring in new slaves. It would just be the people who were there. And the idea was that it would eventually die off, okay? And it might have. This might have worked, with the exception of what we're going to learn about soon, which is the cotton gin. The cotton gin makes growing cotton massively more valuable. Way, way, way easier. And once you have the cotton gin, then you need a lot of cheap workers to get and pick that cotton. And that means you need slaves. And that is going to insanely grow slavery in the South, okay? At this point, tobacco farming and rice plantations, corn, you have slaves working in these fields, and it sucks. It's not great for them. But it is starting to ease off a little bit, or the amount of money you're making versus how much you're spending on the slaves and how much your time and energy you're spending trying to make sure these people don't escape, because nobody likes it. Nobody wants to be there. It's a lot of work, okay? And if you're not making massive sums of money, it's not worth it. So once the cotton gin comes around, suddenly, I can get rich by having slaves. Well, yeah, sure, I'm pro-slavery, is what you'll get a bunch of people talking about, okay? So that's a great, terrible thing. The cotton gin's a great invention, but I just wish it had come 30, 40 years later after slavery had been abolished. But it did not. And maybe I'm being naive. Maybe slavery would have continued even without the cotton gin. I don't know for a fact. It had been sort of on the decline, and then the cotton gin popped up, and it was not going anywhere after that. It was massively successful while the cotton gin was going around. For the white folks, the black folks, very not successful. Real bad. Fugitive slave cause is into the Constitution, which is pretty messed up. Common markets, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So before there was Democrats and Republicans, there was Federalists and Anti-Federalists. There's not really a good analog. These people were big government, these people were small government, but it's still pretty, so you could say Democrats and Republicans, but it doesn't really work. So I don't like trying to put labels on people of modern political parties, because things have changed so much. It's also weird when you try and say that Lincoln was a Republican. I mean, yes, he was technically a Republican, but the whole Republican Democrats parties undergo massive changes in the 20th century to the point that they are absolutely unrecognizable. The voter base flips in the 1950s, where basically the Democrats become the northern and the Republicans become the southern, where originally the Democrats, the Dixiecrats, were the South racist folks. Specifically, they were the ones who wanted slavery, and the Republicans were the ones who did not want slavery, right? But all of that sort of changes, or the where you're voting and all that changes. I'm not trying to say Republicans currently are racist. That's too political for where I'm going for. I'm just talking about past stuff where it's as definitive as you get. They literally voted, the Dixiecrats, the Democrats back then, literally voted for slavery. Anyway, we'll move off that. But Federalists and Anti-Federalists were the two big parties, the only real parties then. Hamilton is a Federalist. Madison and Jefferson are Anti-Federalists. Though they go back and forth, actually, because Jefferson, as much as he says that he doesn't want big government, he ends up being leading the government to have the biggest, most the biggest power hike. And Madison, who originally is a Federalist, ends up kind of leaning into the Anti-Federalist camp. So, anyway, book does a pretty good job about that. These bits here are really important. Okay, but the book does fine on it. Talking about the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers, by the way, are where the Supreme Court justices get a lot of their constitutionality arguments from. The idea that, because it's basically the framers of the Constitution, specifically Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and Madison, all talking about why and what their goals were. Okay, so a lot of constitutional scholars go back to the Federalist Papers. Super important. Bill of Rights. This is interesting. So the Bill of Rights, the Federalists actually did not want this for a while. Alexander Hamilton thought this was unnecessary. The reason why he thought it was unnecessary is because he's coming from this English idea of you don't need things written down, because if it's written down, then that's everything. That's the end all and be all, right? You only have the rights that are written down. And so in the kind of English version there are understood rights. There is a common law set of rights, which is kind of historical precedent. And Madison and a few others, I think rightly, decided that no, Alexander Hamilton, you're wrong. We should have these things enshrined, specifically saying, laid out, these are our rights. And Alexander Hamilton relents, and we get the Bill of Rights, which is the Constitution passes without these, with the understanding that these will be the first thing we do. And these are amendments to the Constitution that came right away. They were specifically set up. These first 10 amendments to the Constitution were set up so that these are the rights of the people under the government. Now, a few things. The freedom of speech, religion, and press, okay, this is freedom of speech for the government, okay? The government has no ability to imprison you for the things you say. Corporations absolutely can deplatform you if you're saying some stupid stuff, okay? Twitter has no reason to force you to or to be forced to keep you on Twitter if you're saying really, really stupid and hurtful things. Twitter is a public company, or was. I guess now it's a private company because Elon Musk owns it. No corporation is forced to let you be on there and talk about whatever stuff you want to talk about, okay? The government cannot jail you for saying stuff. You can go out into the streets, you can say every hateful thing you want to say, and the government is not going to throw you in prison. Now, if you start threatening people, that is an infringement on their rights. So if I say I'm going to kill you and this is how I'm going to do it, you're probably going to get thrown in jail. That's not because your speech has been is being infringed, but because you are now planning an action and the law enforcement is allowed to step in. Right to bear arms. This is a very, very contentious. We talk about this all the time. You know, some people talk about well-regulated militia, the right to keep and bear arms. Some people point to, well, this is allowing the police to bear arms because the police are public and non-military people, so they of course have the ability to have guns. Other people say no, this means that everyone who wants a gun in America can have a gun. Some people point to bear arms, specifically not arms of a bear. This term is usually meant for military. So this idea is that against this is like you can have a rifle but maybe not a pistol. Some people make that argument. Other people say no, it's any gun. Some people say, well, back then they didn't expect you to have AK-47s, so you should have the right to have a musket, and that should be it. I don't know. People have all sorts of different thoughts on here. I'm not gonna say my thought. I'm just going to, mention that this phrase, well-regulated militia and to keep and bear arms, is very, very fraught. People are looking at that and dissecting those words over and over again to try and come up with all sorts of different definitions. And it's interesting how many definitions come out of it. You would think it's a simple, okay, so this is what we do. Huge court cases about that. Third Amendment never really comes up. This was a whole deal back then, right? This is one of the reasons we went to war. And yet now it's just not, doesn't show up. Fourth Amendment, protection against searches and seizures without a warrant based on reasonable grounds. Okay. This one is super important. Okay. It probably gets infringed a lot, yet people don't always know to cite their Fourth Amendment. So there's people in prison who probably could have gotten out of prison if they'd had better lawyers who had talked about, and knew how to use the Fourth Amendment to protect their people. Because if the police search you without probable cause, they find something on you that's illegal, that may not actually be admissible in court unless they had probable cause or a warrant. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here that you have the right to your privacy. Fifth Amendment, this is super important as well. Pleading your fifth, you cannot be forced in a trial to provide evidence against yourself, as well as can't be tried against the same crime twice, which may or may not. If new evidence comes out, sometimes you can get something, but generally, though, this is a huge thing for prosecutors where they want to make sure they have a really strong case before they try you. Unjust deprivation of life, liberty, or property. Right to refuse to testify. Okay, life, liberty, or property. That is straight John Locke. Sixth Amendment, right to a fair and speedy trial. This is a huge deal right now because we are so backlogged on our trials. There is a huge chance that a lot of people's Sixth Amendments are being broken. Right? If it takes a year where you're just sitting in jail waiting to even figure out if you're guilty, right? You are not guilty until the judge says you are guilty. The police do not shoot guilty people; they shoot innocent people, right? Because nobody is guilty until proven so in a court of law. Now, that doesn't mean that police don't have the right to shoot somebody who's got a gun out. They have the right to defend themselves, but technically, you are not guilty until you've been proven so in a court of law. Okay, everyone is innocent until proven guilty. Okay, that's enshrined in our Constitution. So you have the right to a fair and speedy trial. So lots of people are sitting around in our jails even though they have not even yet had a trial. So we really need to figure out our justice system to get that sped up. And I don't think that's a political thing so much as a thing that right and left are both aware of and trying to fix. So both people have different sides on how they're going to do it, but I think most people in America would agree that we need to figure out a way to fix it. Now, how we fix it, that's where the right and left disagree. Right to a jury trial in certain civil cases, protection against excessive bail or cruel and unusual punishment, protection against others taking away rights not mentioned in the Bill of Rights. Ninth Amendment. So when we talk about the right to an abortion, okay, when Roe versus Wade came about, there's no right to an abortion here, right? It doesn't say, the Bill of Rights does not say women have a right to an abortion. Doesn't show up. What the justices did during Roe versus Wade is they looked at this and they said, well, between the Fourth Amendment and the Ninth Amendment, you have the right to privacy, okay? They believe that these two together created a right of privacy. And then they went on to say that your right for an abortion falls under your right for privacy. Now, recently that was overturned, and whether or not that stays overturned or Congress actually creates a law on that or whatever, that's all future. Right now, the important thing is that right to privacy, okay? Does that still exist? And the question about that is important because when we're talking about our internet searches and our life on the internet, do we have a right to privacy? Because the government can spy on us, right? Is it against the law for the government to spy on us? Is it against the law for the government to know what I put into Google? Is it against the law for the government to know exactly where I am at all times? I mean, Google knows where I am at all times, but, just like up here, Google is a company that I have paid money to use their stuff, or they are making money off my advertising. Do they have a right to be able to do that? Well, I don't have to use Google. I could use DuckDuckGo. I could use something else, right? But does the government have a right to know where I am at all times? So this right to privacy is still ongoing in many court cases and is much, much bigger than even just abortion. And it's kind of cobbled together between these two amendments. It'd be interesting if we had an amendment that specifically said we have a right to privacy. That could be something that comes up. 10th Amendment, right of states and citizens to retain powers not given to the federal government. If the federal government doesn't have power, the states and the citizens have those powers. Okay, that's kind of an interesting one. So these are the first 10. We get some more later on, but all right. Sorry, that's a big chapter, guys. That's a lot. There's a lot of important stuff there. The book does a pretty good job on some of it, but there's some important parts there too. Sorry, this is probably my longest video. Have a good one, guys. Bye.